So I work on a lot of different things. I guess the biggest one right now is I have a company with my brothers that we co-founded about a year and a half ago. Um, and it's called Dive Studios. And pretty much it started at my kitchen counter in Korea. We were looking at like the best ways for artists to connect with fans. And as everybody knows, Facebook, Instagram, all these social media platforms, it's all algorithmically driven. And so even if I put something out into the universe, chances are majority of my fans aren't going to see it. So how do we engage like the biggest super fans? And at that moment, it was like, what if we try podcasts? Like people who really love listening to me are going to come to this podcast for updates on me and my life. And nobody in the K-pop space had done a podcast before. So we tried it out, we put it out into the world. We hit number one and number two in I think like 28 or 29 countries. And we were like, oh, this is really interesting. Like it seemed like somewhat of a minimal effort at the time, but we did really well. And so what happened is we started to find other friends and like my peers and people who we're like, you know what, podcast might be the future, guys. Like audio is the future. Like, let's dig into it. And so we ended up making what started as like kind of a side project into like a full business podcast network. So we have right now, we have studios in LA and in Seoul. We have, I think, like 14 shows under our belt, maybe 6 or 7 that are actively going. The majority of them are in English, hosted by a bunch of different K-pop stars and legends in their own right. And that's what we've been working on for the most part. And then as we've been trying to figure out how do you run a startup, and we have all these investors and backers and figuring all that kind of startup stuff out, it's also figuring out how do we scale this into like a real business that isn't reliant simply on podcast advertising, because as I'm sure you may know, it's not the most reliable source of income. So what ended up happening is we realized that like podcasting in Korea had a very negative connotation, because when podcasts first entered the market, it was all politically driven, and it was very just like, it was very polarizing in many ways. So I didn't know this until much later, but there were just a lot of things that had happened, I guess, in the podcast space that had turned people off from podcasts. So right now it's a much older listenership. And I don't think the shows and the charts are like as dynamic as we see everywhere else in the world. And so when we approached like different K-pop artists or companies to join, we had a really hard time convincing them to consider doing audio podcasts, because for the amount of time and the resources that are put into it, like the returns on investment can be very, very minimal. And so we're like, this doesn't seem to make sense right now, maybe because we're too early to the market and monetization. Even in the States, we're figuring it out. But in Asia, it's like even further behind. So what we've been doing is we've been really tracking like what are things that our audience, our fans of Dive, but also fans of our artists really like, that they find the most value from. Where do they derive the most impact and value? And we realize it's around conversations that our celebrity hosts have that are very intimate, that are deep, and they are centered around things that they generally wouldn't talk about anywhere else. And so that ended up in us creating a new audio platform, and it's called Mindset. And we just launched it like 3 weeks ago, but it's pretty much a collection of audio stories that are kind of autobiographically driven. And we take moments from my life and all these other lives, and we tell them in this beautifully crafted way, just really giving fans what they really want to know about their favorite artists, and allowing artists to be incredibly vulnerable about their stories, because we're making sure that the stories are told in the right way, in a very safe way. And so that's kind of like what has consumed my life, I'd say, for the past year, outside of being a musician. And what we realize is like the traction's been great, the feedback's been great. People love the podcast as a more casual way to listen and to do it while you're driving or showering or whatever. And then Mindset is much more of a deep impact, mental health, wellness kind of thing that is filling a white space in the audio market. So that's kind of what we're doing at the moment, and that's been my full-time job for I don't know how long. And on the side, when I get a moment, I'm working on an album. So that's what's going on right now.
있어도 그래도 떠날래 그래 떠날게 여기서 나가도 아플 땐 아파도 힘들 수 있어도 그래도 떠날래 이제 떠날게